Hi again, everyone, and welcome to Codicology 3.2. This is an extension of the Grammar of Legibility lectures that I'm giving for this week's unit. And in this lecture, we're going to talk about errors and methods of correction. This one shouldn't be that long a lecture. Really, this is covered very, very well in the Clemens and Graham textbook, and I encourage you to make sure you do read that section of the text. The PowerPoint that I've got to show you, I essentially just kind of outline some of the definitions that you will find in Clemens and Graham, but principally this is an opportunity for me to show you some examples of correction activities that are used in Ohio State University manuscripts. So let me get this started and shared, and we will go from there. Let's see. The delay. Okay, so corrections are all sorts of varieties of scribal errors. I haven't listed all of them here, but you can have errors as mundane as ink spills, simple misspellings, putting words in the wrong order, simply nodding off and trailing your pen off. I've done this many a time. Shamefully back in my freshman year in college. There are all sorts of things that can introduce errors into a text. The kind of specialist stuff that Clemens and Graham talk about, though, are all different varieties of eye skip. And eye skip is when a scribe's eye jumps backwards or forwards to the wrong letter or textual string because of the recurrence of similar letters, words, or phrases that appear in close proximity. There's going to be a really good example of this in our slides in a few seconds that result in the omission or recopying of text. So there are different types of eye skip that you can subdivide things into, demarcating different kinds of error. So the first is homeoarcton, which is caused when two words have the same letters at their beginning. Similarly, you have homeoteluton, which is caused when two words have the same letters at their ending rather than the beginning. So dumemomem, which is extended omission caused by recurrence of word or phrase in close proximity. And ditography, where you have the scribe simply recopying the same passage, the same word, whatever it might be, in full because identical words or phrases occur twice in very, very close proximity, sometimes, bookending the same section of text or same small section of text. So let's take a few looks at some things in Ohio State's own collections that are a little bit interesting that illustrate the ways that scribes would correct these things. So they wouldn't just throw away a page. Parchment, even paper, is too expensive, too precious, and the process of writing is too time intensive. For most scribes, trying to create things that are functional at the very least, to make them want to throw things away simply because of an error. This is very much unlike, say, scribal traditions you might see in Jewish culture, where writing out the Torah, for instance, if you make an error, you are expected to actually discard the entire manuscript that's been written up to that point. There is no room for error and there's no room for correction. You have to get it right all in one go. That doesn't exist quite so much with Western European medieval manuscripts. So let's take a look at a few different ways that scribes would use to correct these different kinds of errors. We've got erasure. That's pretty self-explanatory. Strike through, where you're drawing through or completely obliterating text by scribbling ink over it or just doing a line through it. Subpunction, where you're putting dots underneath the text that you're supposed to disregard. Insertions, these can be above the line or in the margins, where a scribe has skipped a word and just needs to slip it on in there. And then insertions very often of larger bits of text that have been left out by means of time marks or visual symbols that appear both in the margin where the corrected text is and within the text block where the text should be and where it should be read. So let's take a look at some of these. Erasure is rather simple. It's where you've got errors and then a penknife or some other kind of sharp object is used to scrape away the offending text, and then the new corrected text is written in above it. So what we've got here on the top, that image is from circa 1340 Psalter created for the parish church of St. Botolph's in Aiken in East Anglia in England. And below that, we have a roughly 1375 manuscript of Bernardus Guidonus's Speculum Sanctorale, a collection of saints' lives. And this manuscript was put together in Bohemia. And we see erasure pretty pronouncedly in both of these manuscripts. How do you think you might be able to tell what erasure has happened and where the corrected text is in the image on the top? Take a second. It's really not that difficult. It's where the text is darker and darker ink. That is corrected text. And if you look closely, you can see areas that have been erased, especially if you look at the end of line 3, the word eorum. That is both in darker ink, but it's also, it appears a little ragged. It's a little rough. If you look in line 1 above that, you'll see also rough text there. And what this is the actual skin gets abraded when you're picking away at it to get the ink out of the skin. This is even more apparent in the image at the bottom of the screen, where you can see the second line from the bottom, especially, that is entirely rewritten text, and it gets very, very ragged in its appearance. So simple picking out and then putting the new text in above it. Now, there's a key to this. When you see erasure of this type, what's happened, well, we've described what happened, but it's only used on parchment manuscripts. Paper manuscripts are not going to sustain this kind of treatment. So what we start to see in paper manuscripts, and this can also be used in parchment manuscripts, but in paper manuscripts like this one, which is from an early 15th century copy that we have here of St. Gregory the Great's treatise on preaching, we can see in the bottom left here an example of simple strike through, and if you look at the top right, another example of simple strike through where words have been improperly added and the scribe just goes through, or possibly a reader or a corrector at a later point has gone through and said, wait a minute, these aren't supposed to be here, and drawn a line through it. Next we have subpunction. This, in my experience, isn't one of the most common types of correction method you're gonna see, but you will encounter it if you look at enough manuscripts. And what we've got here is simply a tool where you would put dots under any portion of text that is supposed to be disregarded by the reader. And in many cases, the reader or a corrector goes through and reinforces this by striking it through. The image on the bottom left, you can see that happening, where we've got the line going through on line 3, the line going through that one word, and you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different dots underneath that word. If we look at the image on the right, let me move the picture of myself up here and bring it down here. If you look at the top, very, very top line, you're going to see the last word on that line is Nabugodo, and then it carries on to line 2, Nosor, Nabucodonosor Rex, King Nebuchadnezzar. And then if you look at the next word after that, it's Tunc, T-U-N-C, and it's been crossed out, but also subpuncted. You can see that happening all the way down for a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 into the 6th line from where that correction begins. And you can see that that entire section of text has been subpuncted and then crossed out. And what we have here is a case of ditography. So if you look at the very end of that crossed out area, you're going to see the repetition of Nabucodonosor Rex. And indeed, if you look at the preceding page for this, that exact passage of text has already been written. What I like about this example of correction, however, is that it shows scribal process and cooperation happening in the workshop. So we've got this error that's been made. And then what we have here is testimony that there was a formal correction practice or corrector working in this scribal workshop. And that corrector has gone through this Bible and he's subpuncted, in this case, the error, and then had it corrected. And right next to it, you can probably not make it out too well, but it looks like there are some pencil smudges right there. And actually, if this were a clearer image, or if you were looking at the manuscript in person, you would see that it spells out superfluum est. This is superfluous. And that's been written in medieval pencil there by the corrector. So here we have a corrector signaling to the scribe that this needs to come out, and the scribe has gone through and then scratched out, not scratched out, but stricken through that writing. Here we have an example of simple insertion where the word oculi, plural for eyes, has been left out of the text, and we see that in the margin in this little frame. But if you carry on at the same level as oculi is written, that line of text, if you get right in the middle, just before the word eorum, you're going to see a caret, little caret sticking in there, indicating that this is supposed to go in there. So as you're reading along in the text, as the reader, you would spot that caret, and it would be the signal to you that you need to punch out to the margins, and you'll find, you know, a little insertion letter or insertion word there. And then tied to insertion, or similar to insertion, you have tie marks, but this is for more pronounced errors where you have larger chunks of text that have been excised, or not excised, but left out. And if you look at the bottom right of this image, you're going to see a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 line chunk of text in the margin. And just above that first word, you're going to see 2 dots with a bit of an angled line above it. If you follow that in 3 lines from the bottom in the main text block, if you follow that in, you're going to see that same symbol reproduced. And this operates in much the same way as the caret did in the insertion example above, where as you're reading along, you see that little mark and you kick out into the manuscript's margin to find that mark and then read that text and mentally insert it into the text block. Often, these tie marks were used in cases where there were quite a few errors in a manuscript, and you can use different symbols for your tie marks in order to help readers navigate the margins. And so in this case, if you look above that, you're going to see simply the word Judas, and it goes in right where that tie mark area is, where it says Videas. So you've got 2 types of tie marks happening here. So these are the very, very basic ways that scribes used to correct errors that were pretty much rife throughout medieval texts. One of the fun things I like to do in looking at manuscripts is try to identify all of the different types of methods that might be used in a single manuscript, but then to try to see how those corrections are indicative of the way a manuscript was read, how it was interacted with, whether it's in the scribal workshop, where it's a tandem of corrections happening between a formal corrector or an overseer of the process and the scribe itself, whether it's the reader that's gone through and added that correction or added the insertions if they have a different copy of the text and they want to throw in, you know, via tie mark something else. But then also another thing I like to do is identify all sorts of different ways and creative ways that readers and correctors chose to fix the errors that somehow crept into the texts that they wrote and the texts that they read. So that concludes the lecture for corrections. Feel free to go back through this lecture, and I encourage you to pause on the individual images so you can take a look and really come to grips with the different styles that are being used here.